Washington, D.C., a formation of identical white-top helicopters, rises from the ground, low, loud, fast. From a few hundred feet below, they look exactly the same. And somewhere inside that formation is the President of the United States. But here's the unsettling part. You can't tell which one. Not from the ground, not from the shape, not from the paint. And sometimes, not even from the aircraft's position in the formation. Because the helicopter carrying the President isn't necessarily the helicopter you thought you were watching. The Marines call it the presidential shell game. And the idea behind it is brutally simple. If you can't identify the President's helicopter, you can't easily target the President's helicopter. Up to 5 nearly identical aircraft can launch together. One carries the President, the others become decoys. And almost immediately after leaving the ground, the formation begins to move. One aircraft slides across, another drops back, the lead changes, the formation breaks, then reforms. The choreography can happen in seconds, and from the ground, your certainty disappears with it. You may have watched the President take off. You may have watched every helicopter leave the lawn, but you still don't know which aircraft has him. That is the point. A presidential helicopter departure looks almost ceremonial. A Marine in dress blue stands at the aircraft. The salute, the doorway, the President steps aboard, cameras roll, everything appears visible. And yet almost none of it tells you what you actually want to know, because the important information isn't what the public sees, is what the public can't distinguish. The wheels leave the ground, and the security problem changes instantly. The aircraft are no longer sitting in predictable positions. They're moving, matching, swapping, reforming. 5 machines can become one moving question. Which one has the President? And notice what makes the deception work. The decoys don't need to look threatening. They need to look identical, because the objective isn't to defeat an attack after it begins. It's to make the attacker uncertain about where to begin. But deception has a physical cost. These aren't lightweight aircraft. The older VH-3D Sea King, for example, has a maximum gross weight of about 21,500 pounds and uses 2 General Electric T58-GE-400B turboshaft engines. Its newer successor, the VH-92A Patriot, is even larger, with a published maximum gross weight of 27,700 pounds and 2 GECT 7-8A6 turboshaft engines. That's an enormous amount of machine to keep in the air, while simultaneously keeping several other machines in exactly the right place. Every position change costs energy. Every correction requires power. Every aircraft has to maintain formation without becoming the aircraft that suddenly looks different, because the instant one decoy falls behind or takes a noticeably different line, the illusion starts to crack. And that's why redundancy matters. The presidential helicopter is not designed around the assumption that everything will go perfectly. It's designed around the assumption that something might not. 2 engines, multiple aircraft, multiple crews, multiple layers of protection. The philosophy is simple. Don't build a system around what happens when everything works. Build it around what happens when something doesn't. Now, look closely at the helicopters. Green fuselage, white upper section, the famous white tops. That appearance has become part of the visual identity of the presidential helicopter fleet. But the paint isn't just ceremonial. Sameness is the weapon. If one helicopter were visibly different, a different color, a different silhouette, a different configuration, the entire game would become easier to solve. So the aircraft are made to be difficult to distinguish at useful distances. Same type, same profile, same formation, same route, same movement. The security system turns visual recognition against the observer. You can see everything and still know almost nothing. Now look beyond the helicopters. Look at the sky they're flying through. Washington isn't ordinary airspace. The Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area extends roughly 30 nautical miles around the capital, surrounding an even more restricted flight-restricted zone. Inside it are prohibited areas around locations, including the White House and National Mall. That means the President isn't simply flying through an empty sky. He's flying through a controlled environment. Aircraft entering the area face specific authorization and procedures. Unauthorized aircraft can trigger security responses, and presidential transport is specifically treated as an essential operation within the highly restricted Washington airspace. That matters because the formation doesn't have to defend itself against every aircraft in the sky. The sky is already helping. A random helicopter can't simply decide to follow. A news aircraft can't casually position itself wherever it wants. The airspace itself reduces the number of unknowns. The President's protection begins long before the helicopter takes off. And now comes one of the most interesting details. Marine One isn't a specific aircraft. It's a call sign. The name follows the passenger. When the President is aboard a Marine Corps helicopter, that aircraft becomes Marine One. When the President leaves it, the call sign goes with him. The the same aircraft can receive a different designation when carrying the vice president. So think of Marine One less like a registration number and more like a temporary identity. The helicopter doesn't own the name, the president does. And that creates another layer of ambiguity. If Marine One isn't permanently attached to one airframe, then simply identifying a particular helicopter isn't enough. The name itself is part of the deception. For decades, the recognizable presidential helicopters were the VH-3D Sea King and VH-60N White Hawk. Then came the replacement, the VH-92A Patriot. The Marine Corps declared the VH-92A operationally capable in December 2021, and the program calls for 23 aircraft, 21 operational aircraft, and 2 test aircraft to replace the older presidential fleet. The new helicopter is based on the Sikorsky S-92 platform, but heavily modified for presidential transport, including specialized communications and executive systems. And here's the interesting part. The machine may be new, the mission isn't, because regardless of which generation of helicopter is carrying the president, the fundamental requirement remains the same. Don't let the world know exactly where he is until you have to. Now, the formation is moving over Washington. From the ground, it looks like a few helicopters, but the operation behind those helicopters is enormous. The crews belong to Marine Helicopter Squadron 1, HMX-1, the Nighthawks. Based at Marine Corps Air Facility, Quantico, HMX-1 is responsible for presidential helicopter transportation and operates multiple aircraft types, including the VH-3D, VH-60N, VH-92A, and MV-22B. And HMX-1 is not a normal squadron. It has historically had more than 700 personnel and has been described as the largest permanently formed aircraft squadron in the Marine Corps. Think about that. Hundreds of people supporting a mission that, from the outside, may look like a helicopter flight lasting only minutes. Pilots, crew chiefs, maintenance personnel, communication specialists, security, operations, logistics, support staff. Because presidential transportation isn't one aircraft, it's an ecosystem. And every layer exists for the same reason. The president has to arrive without giving away the information that could make his arrival dangerous. The story goes back much further than the modern white tops. In 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower became the first U.S. president to use an HMX-1 helicopter for rapid transportation, flying from Newport, Rhode Island, to Naval Air Station Quonset Point to connect with Air Force One. That first flight wasn't the beginning of the modern shell game, but it began a presidential tradition that has lasted for nearly 7 decades. Today, the technology is radically more sophisticated. The communications, the aircraft, the airspace, the security procedures, the coordination. But the underlying problem hasn't changed. A president is a single person. A helicopter is a single target. So the system creates uncertainty around that target. Because none of this works unless the people operating it can be trusted. Before personnel are assigned to sensitive presidential support duties, they undergo extensive security screening. The Defense Department's governing instruction is DoD Instruction 5-210.87, covering the selection of military, civilian, and contractor personnel for presidential support activities. The administrative nickname associated with these investigations is Yankee White. The reason is obvious. The most sophisticated helicopter in the world doesn't matter if the wrong person knows where it will be. The most restricted airspace in America doesn't matter if the wrong person has the schedule. And the perfect decoy formation doesn't matter if someone can simply reveal which aircraft is real. So the final layer isn't mechanical, it's human. Trust is engineered, access is controlled, information is compartmentalized, and the people who keep the system running become part of the security system themselves. So when you watch those white-top helicopters crossing Washington, don't think you're watching a helicopter escort. You're watching a moving shell game. One aircraft carries the president. Several others exist to make that fact harder to determine. The formation moves. The airspace is controlled. The aircraft are deliberately similar. The call sign follows the passenger. And behind all of it is an organization built around one extraordinary requirement. The president can be visible without being identifiable. That's the trick. The world is allowed to watch the helicopters rise. The world is allowed to watch the formation cross the city. For as long as possible, the one piece of information that matters most remains hidden. Which helicopter has the president? 5 helicopters, 1 president. And somewhere between the moment the wheels leave the ground and the moment the formation disappears over the horizon, the answer is deliberately lost. That isn't a flaw in the system. That's the system. A presidential helicopter flight looks almost effortless. 10 minutes in the air, formation over Washington, a landing on the South Lawn. Then it's over. But that 10-minute flight is the visible tip of a machine that has been working for days, sometimes weeks, before the first rotor ever turns. Because when the passenger is the president of the United States, nothing is routine. Not the pilot, not the mechanic, not the helicopter, not even the patch of grass where the wheels are going to touch down. Every person assigned to HMX-1, the Marine Corps squadron responsible for presidential helicopter transport, goes through a single-scope background investigation. Investigators can work backward through roughly a decade of a person's life, finances, foreign contacts, associations, and the people they've lived with. And that scrutiny doesn't stop with the pilots. It extends to crew chiefs, maintainers, mechanics, down to the people whose hands were on the aircraft hours before takeoff. Because the rule is simple. If you can touch the machine, you have to be trusted. And the machines themselves have to earn that trust. HMX-1 has actually been doing something long before it ever carried a precedent. The squadron has served as the Marine Corps' primary operational test and evaluation unit for new rotorcraft since 1947, 10 years before it began transporting precedents. That means the Marines flying America's most carefully protected aviation mission spend their other days doing something that sounds completely different. They break new aircraft, they push them, stress them, find their weaknesses. And only after those machines have been tested does one of them get the presidential mission. That's exactly what happened with the Bell Boeing MV-22 Osprey. The aircraft can take off vertically like a helicopter, then rotate its engines forward and cruise like an airplane. HMX-1 tested the Osprey before it became part of the Presidential Support Fleet in 2013. In other words, the squadron responsible for protecting the future of marine aviation is also responsible for transporting the most protected person in America. And those missions require different tools. Because today's helicopter isn't simply whichever aircraft happens to be available. HMX-1's presidential fleet has 3 distinct types. Think of it like a golf bag. 3 clubs, 3 different jobs. And you don't use the driver when the shot calls for a wedge. First, there's the Sikorsky YH-3D Sea King. This is the icon, the stub-nosed helicopter, whose silhouette has appeared over the White House since the late 1970s. Inside is a spacious, sound-insulated presidential cabin, capable of carrying more than a dozen people. Quiet enough for conversations to continue beneath the rotors. The VH-3D is now approaching the end of its service life. Beside it is the smaller VH-60N White Hawk, a presidential derivative of the Army's Black Hawk. It's the compact specialist of the fleet. Smaller, more maneuverable, better suited to landing zones where space, altitude, heat, or obstacles make a larger helicopter less practical. And then there's the newest member of the family, the VH-92A Patriot. Based on Sikorsky's S-92, a civilian helicopter that accumulated more than 1 million flight hours, transporting offshore crews and conducting search and rescue missions before receiving government paint. By August 2024, 23 VH-92As had been delivered. It is, by a wide margin, the newest and most capable machine in the hangar. But capability doesn't decide which helicopter flies. The landing zone does. The mission determines the aircraft, and across all 3 types, one number defines the squadron better than any specification sheet ever could. Since 1957, across administrations, crises, wars, and continents, HMX-1 has recorded 0 accidents during a presidential lift. That kind of record isn't luck, it's manufactured. And most of that manufacturing happens long before the aircraft ever appears in the sky. The formation you're watching is following a route that was planned weeks earlier. The schedule permits, crews rehearse the routes, advanced teams inspect the ground, plans are coordinated with the Secret Service and the White House Military Office, the Pentagon-staffed organization responsible for formally tasking presidential flights. By the time the president actually boards, the mission may have already happened several times on paper, but one element receives perhaps the most attention of all. Where are those wheels going to touch down? Before sight enters the plan, HMX-1 surveys it. Approach paths, obstacles, surface conditions, power lines, escape routes, and the alternate landing zones receive the same treatment, because the primary site might become unusable at the last second. The routes connecting those locations are also examined. So are rooftops, sightlines, open areas, potential firing positions, anything that could turn a landing zone into a vulnerability. That mindset goes all the way back to the beginning of the presidential helicopter mission. Even the South Lawn, the most recognizable presidential landing zone in the world, was subjected to trial flights and written procedures before a president ever stepped onto it. It was treated almost like a military objective, and every landing zone since has inherited that mentality. Days of preparation, sometimes weeks, hundreds of people, all for a flight that might last 10 minutes. But that imbalance is exactly the point, because the 10 minutes are not the operation. The preparation is the operation. There's another piece of the system most people never notice. HMX-1 is based at Marine Corps Air Facility Quantico, roughly 30 miles south of Washington. But presidential helicopters also maintain detachments at Naval Support Facility Anacostia in Washington and Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. That positioning matters. A presidential helicopter is supposed to be minutes away when the president needs one. And even when the president is traveling by motorcade, helicopters can be prepositioned nearby, fuel, hangared. They're not necessarily there because a flight is scheduled. Sometimes they're there because something could go wrong. If a situation on the ground suddenly becomes unsafe, the helicopter becomes an exit, a way out that has already been positioned before anyone needs it. Then there are the missions where the destination isn't 10 minutes away. Maybe it's another continent. Maybe it's an ocean away. The helicopters don't simply fly there. They travel as cargo. Before many long-distance presidential trips, a U.S. Air Force C-17 Globemaster III arrives at an airfield near the destination. Its cargo hold is large enough to transport enormous military equipment and large enough to carry presidential helicopters with their rotors folded and secured. This is the part of the operation most people never see. The helicopters may arrive as cargo, be reassembled, inspected, test flown, and positioned before Air Force One even reaches the region. During the earlier C-5 Galaxy era, the larger transport could carry even more helicopters in a single load. Flights supporting the president have their own designation too, Phoenix Banner, a name reserved for airlift missions directly supporting the president. So when a helicopter eventually appears over a summit, a disaster zone, or a foreign capital, it may look as though it simply arrived with the president. It didn't. The operation began much earlier, and somewhere behind the white tops is another fleet almost nobody notices. The green tops. These include the same MV-22 Ospreys used elsewhere by HMX-1, but their mission is completely different. They carry what the presidential helicopters cannot: staff, press, luggage, maintenance marines, equipment, supplies, everything required to make a presidential visit function on the ground. When the president lands in a white top, an unglamorous convoy of green tops may already have done the heavy lifting. And that is when the scale of the operation becomes difficult to ignore. Hundreds of Marines, strategic cargo aircraft, advanced teams, surveyed landing zones, multiple aircraft, sometimes across multiple countries, all supporting what, from the outside, can look like a simple helicopter ride. Marine One has landed at Windsor Castle, at Tokyo's Akasaka Palace, at Bolivar Square in Bogota, and near the Korean demilitarized zone. Framed as a commute, the system can look excessive, but the calculation behind it is brutally simple. The person being protected is not an ordinary passenger. The office cannot simply be replaced. It cannot be ransomed, and the consequences of losing it extend far beyond one individual. The machinery of the American government is built around preventing that possibility. Measured against that risk, 2 helicopters transported inside a C-17 are a rounding error. If this morning feels ordinary, that's because it is. White tops fly constantly around the Washington region, training, currency flights, rehearsals, day after day. Washington residents see formations like this so often that they can become background noise. And that's exactly what HMX-1 wants. A remarkable operation becomes less remarkable when people see it every day. Aircraft appear, they fly, they disappear. No sirens, no spectacle, just another formation crossing the sky. But that's the illusion. The 10 minutes the cameras capture are actually the easiest 10 minutes. The difficult work happened before anyone looked up. The investigation, the maintenance, the rehearsals, the advanced teams, the alternate landing zones, the aircraft positioning, the cargo flights, the security planning, contingency. All of it exists to make those 10 minutes look completely normal. But that raises the obvious question. What exactly is all of this protection preparing for? Formation is still moving over the river. Everything looks normal. So let's imagine that it isn't. Imagine that somewhere along the flight path, a shoulder-fired missile launches from the ground, a heat-seeking man-portable air defense system, a MANPADS. The family includes weapons such as the American Stinger, systems small enough to be carried by an individual, but powerful enough to threaten low-flying aircraft. And suddenly, the entire philosophy behind the presidential helicopter becomes visible, because the next few seconds are not improvised. They are part of a chain the Squadron has spent decades preparing for. First comes detection. On the VH-92A, missile warning sensors are mounted around the aircraft, including on the sponsons, the aerodynamic fairings along the fuselage. Their job is to detect the signatures associated with a missile launch. The warning reaches the aircraft, and then the second layer of the defense system comes into play. A laser-based directed infrared countermeasure system, commonly referred to as DIRCM. Instead of simply trying to outrun the missile, the system is designed to interfere with its infrared seeker. The goal is brutally straightforward: detect the threat, break its lock, keep the aircraft flying. And that is only one layer, because the presidential helicopter isn't built around a single defense. It is built around the assumption that something, someday, might go wrong. And when that happens, the mission is not to make the aircraft invulnerable. No aircraft is. The mission is to give the crew enough warning, enough protection, and enough options to survive the few seconds that matter most. That is the philosophy behind the white tops, not making danger disappear, making sure that when danger arrives, the aircraft is already prepared for it. The most sophisticated defense systems ever carried by a presidential helicopter are built around one idea. The question should never have to be asked. But there's another question Marine One has to answer every day. How far can a helicopter actually take the president? The answer is surprisingly short. Marine One was never designed to replace Air Force One. It's built for the first and last legs of a presidential journey. Its signature route runs from the South Lawn over Washington to Joint Base Andrews, roughly 10 miles. A trip that can replace a 40-minute motorcade without closing streets or exposing the president to traffic. The same logic takes him to Camp David in about half an hour, or to places a motorcade simply can't reach: ships at sea, disaster zones, or locations without secure roads. The VH-92A cruises at roughly 190 miles per hour and has a range of about 620 miles. Impressive for a helicopter, irrelevant compared with Air Force One. The airplane handles the long journey. The Marines handle the first and last 10 miles, but the VH-92A had one bizarre problem. Not missiles, not engines, grass. Its twin engines produce more than 2,500 horsepower each, while exhaust and rotor wash blast the ground beneath it. Testing in 2018 showed that the heat and downwash could damage the South Lawn and in severe cases rip the turf apart. So America had a $5 billion presidential helicopter that couldn't comfortably land at the president's own house. Sikorsky delivered the final aircraft of the initial 23 helicopter fleet on August 14, 2024. At roughly $217 million per aircraft. President Biden flew the VH-92A that same month. But the old VH-3D continued handling White House landings. The granite pad, featuring the White House seal, is estimated at $5 to $6 million, with Sikorsky covering the cost. It's scheduled for completion on September 17th, just before Xi Jinping's planned White House visit. And once that pad is ready, the last obstacle disappears. The VH-3D's nearly half-century watch can finally end. The VH-92A can finally land where it was always supposed to, on the White House lawn.